Welcome to AAPI Asian American Pacific Island Heritage Month. If you saw the previous Ed Family episode, number 108, I was interviewed by Andy Wu and we had a conversation about Asian American ethnic studies courses. In this episode, you're going to hear from Ken Inouye, president of the Japanese American Citizens League. And once again, Ken Inouye is one of the Asian Americans identified by Brian Ahn, doctoral student at Columbia University Teachers College, who's been doing research on influential Asian Americans in Orange County. Also named were Andy Wu, who was the one doing the interview, Marianne Fu of Okapaka, and Michael Matsuda, superintendent of AUHSD. When you hear Ken's story, I think you're going to hear a story of remarkable resilience.
My name is Ken Inouye. I'm a retired CPA. I was born in Colorado, but pretty much raised in Los Angeles. I have 3 grown daughters and 5 grandchildren, and I'm very proud of the fact that all 3 of my daughters carry the torch of advocating for social justice and civil liberties. As a youngster growing up in Los Angeles, and this is right after in the 50s, although nobody talked about what happened to our community during the war, there was a feeling that we needed to prove ourselves. We needed to show that we were good Americans. The only real references to the internment or relocation came from several indirect references. For example, my father really emphasized education. He said, "Ken, you need to get an education." And the reason why is because at one point in time, the government took everything away from us. And the only thing they couldn't take was our education. And as a result of having our education, we were able to come back, and we are still coming back. So that was kind of a veiled reference to what had happened to the whole community at one point in time. Another veiled reference was when I got my driver's license. My father said, there's one place you can never drive in LA. And I thought, okay, he's worried about my safety. I said, okay, Dad, where? And he goes, Beverly Hills. I said, Beverly Hills? I don't even know where that is. That's where the rich people live. Why don't they want me there? He said, because, Ken, the only Japanese they want in Beverly Hills are gardeners or maids. If you go there, you will be arrested. And I think about that. My father was a very prideful man. He got graduated from UCLA with honors. And yet for him to be able to acknowledge racial profiling to his son was, I think, a real indication of the feeling our community had with respect to our place in the community.
Let's talk about that, because many of my Japanese American friends, they have 2 things in their home. They have the shrine for the ancestors. They have family pictures. But they have no memory that relates back to the internment. But when I asked questions about that, a lot of them didn't want to talk about it. And I was wondering, what is that all about?
Well, I think it's an example. When we did the research, we were looking for redress and reparations, we found out that most people, including my own family, said, leave it alone. It's in the past. We want to go forward. And it's similar to kind of a distress situation where people feel like they've been violated for no reason that they could identify, and they just wanted to move on. In fact, when the whole concept of reparations came up, a lot of people in our community said, no, it'll cheapen what we went through. It'll make people think we want to get something. And then finally they realized, wait a minute, we did nothing wrong. There was political things involved that we could not control. And really, you're not seeking something. 4 or 5 years of your life were taken from you. And the Constitution under the Second Amendment guarantees the rights to seek reparations and redress. So that's kind of what guided the communities going forward. The other thing that I wanted to say, Alan, in terms of trying to prove that we belong, even though I was an honor student in college, my father said, when you graduate, you're going to have to work harder than most because you're going to have to prove that you belong. So even that many years after the internment and the whole relocation, I think my father's advice still indicated a feeling that we needed to prove we were good Americans. So that was kind of my first exposure, if you will, to the fact that we were, in some ways, felt like we were not the same as others.
Is that why what led you to join the salon called JACL and then became national president of the Japanese American Citizen League?
Well, I joined JACL because it was a community-based organization, and its mission was something I could embrace. I grew up in South Central LA, and I saw that there's a lot of people not treated equally, not just the Japanese, but particularly the African Americans. And I felt that the Japanese American Citizens League would be an organization that would advocate for the rights of all. I think the real coming of age, if you will, of understanding the role of an organization was when we saw redress and reparations. And although most people thought we had no chance in the heck of getting any kind of reparations, the national president, who became a friend of mine at that time, said, "Ken, we'll get it because we have justice on our side." And over the next couple of years, we saw the bills go through Congress. We saw how, like on the House side, the Speaker of the House was, I forget his name, but he was from Texas. And Texas had the Lost Battalion. And because the Lost Battalion was saved by the Go for Broke unit, he was very instrumental in helping to get the bill through the House of Representatives. And there was stories throughout different areas, like in Orange County. There was a Japanese American who was very active, Clarence Nishizu, very active in Orange County politics. And because the Republican members of the House respected him, we got two very conservative members of the House to vote for redress. And that kind of led the way for other people to vote. On the Senate side, we had Senator Inouye and Senator Matsunaga, people that really know and respected them. And as a result, the bill passed a lot easier on the Senate side. But I think the lesson I learned was that if you have justice on your side, people will recognize the fact that there's something that needs to be done. And I can remember when Reagan signed the bill, I took my family to Manzanar. And I told them this is the greatest country in the history of the world, because I can't think of any other country that have taken this kind of action so many years after the fact to recognize they made such a mistake. And there's a particular unique tie to Orange County to Reagan. When the bill first came up, Reagan said he wasn't going to sign the bill. He was very conservative. He didn't want to give any kind of money out for something that happened so long ago. But during the war, Ronald Reagan was a civilian representative of the Department of the Army. During the war, there was a Go for Broke veteran, Kazuo Masuda, who was killed in Europe. They wanted to bring his body back to Orange County to be buried. And the people in Orange County says, "No, we don't want this Jap buried in Orange County." Well, the military community knew what the Go for Broke unit did. They knew what they had done in sacrifice. So they sent the community attaché, who was a young lieutenant named Ronald Reagan, to Orange County. And Ronald Reagan said, "This man will be buried in Orange County. The blood of all Americans is the same. He will be buried here." So during the process of the redress bills going through Congress, Kazuo Masuda's sister wrote President Reagan and said, "I don't know if you remember me, but you are so kind to recognize the sacrifices of my brother, and I hope you'll support the bill." When President Reagan saw that letter, he said, "Yes, I'll support the bill." So, I have a great feeling of belief in this country and its institutions. And one of the reasons that I've gotten involved with, through the institution of like the Human Relations Commission is because I believe you need to work internally. Not to necessarily tell people what to do, but perhaps to bring attention to things. For example, you remember Ellen, the Tiananmen Lee murder many years ago in Westminster. The guy was killed. He was stabbed multiple times, and the killer wrote with the guy's blood on the wall, "Died Jap." And yet, at that moment in time, they weren't going to call it a hate crime. And I can remember at that point, I was with JACL and also with the Human Relations Commission. I went down there and I said, "Well, wait a minute. Now, if we don't acknowledge what this is, you're victimizing the family twice. Once by the loss of a loved one, and second by not recognizing what it really was." And over time, they finally acknowledged the fact that it was a hate crime. But back then, remember, Alan, Orange County was a place with no hate
Yeah.
crimes. We were Disneyland.
Yeah.
Everybody got along, which was not necessarily true. And that poor police chief, he was the community didn't want to have any problems in the community. The city council didn't want to have any community things, so he was kind of in a really bad place. So let's flash forward to this year about this anti-Asian hate. So what happens? First of all, the Orange County Board of Supervisors issues a strong anti-hate proclamation, which absolutely says they stand against anti-Asian hate. But more importantly, the two Asian American members of the Board of Supervisors, Andrew Dill, Lisa Park, also issued statements. They were the ones that authored the statements. One step further, Lisa Bartlett, who's a Japanese American, she actually put together a bill authorizing $1 million to help create a hate crime network in Orange County to make sure that there be resources available to the victims, also a way to report hate crimes, and to bring the community some sense of security and safety. So that's what I mean. If you work, and it's not just me, it's the whole community working together. But if the community recognizes that some of us are hurting and comes together to help, then that's how we get things done.
You connected the past, what was currently going on, but I want to take you back to the early days when there were not a lot of us around. I think around 1980s, it was like about 86,000 Asian American, and we're relatively small. There were few people in positions of authority or heading companies and all that. And here you are. You moved out of South Central, you got your degree, and you're moving to start your life here in Orange County. What was it kind of like there at the time? And how did that lead you to join the Orange County Human Relations?
I think there's a natural instinct for people to kind of associate with people of their own. I think that we all have a certain comfort level. Just by way of additional information, the Japanese American community has had some very significant pioneers before me that have kind of laid the path, if you will, or that people know that Asian Americans are here and they're really productive members of the community.
Like Roy Uno and those guys in Fountain Valley.
Well, of course, the first mayor of Fountain Valley, Jim Kano. Yeah. There's also Aji Yamagata Noji.
Yes.
There is Dr. Samuel Lee as an example, who's a Korean American. So, Clarence Nishizu, who was he was the chairman of the grand jury. So there's been Asian Americans, and I'm sure there's more that I'm not mentioning. Asian Americans have been in important positions of volunteerism, but not necessarily policy. And I think that's the idea of maybe getting there to be at least counselor to let people know what's going on. In my particular case, the thing that absolutely made me really get involved with Orange County in particular was there was a hate crime against the Asian and Japanese American Community Center. And I went there, and it's interesting. I saw a grown man crying, my father's generation crying, because they said, why can't they leave us alone? Why can't they recognize we're Americans? So as I went to the sheriff's station and I asked them, what can we do? And the sheriff looked at me, because he didn't know the Japanese community. He just looked at me, and it wasn't the sheriff, it was the substation. The guy looked at me and says, Canada's a bunch of kids, bunch of vandalism. But at that moment in time, this is so strange. All three of the major networks called the guy and said, what are you going to do about it? And then after he took the call from ABC, CBS, and NBC, he put down the phone and he says, Ken, I guess I'll get involved with this person. But then I realized they didn't know who we are. They had no reason to really do anything because on the surface, it was kids having fun to him. And that's when I decided to join an organization that would give our community a presence with policymakers. That's why I asked, what organization could I join? And everybody said the Orange County Human Relations Commission.
For us that were behind you coming up and entering Orange County, we needed to reach out to people like you and Jim and Roy, and kind of helping us kind of find the ropes of what to do. And so we're kind of grateful for that. In seeing us young bamboos coming into Orange County, how did you feel?
Well, first of all, I take no credit. I mean, I think we all do what we need to do based upon our life experiences, and I'm just very fortunate to know people like yourself, Marianne, and, and Michael, and of course Mr. Kim now, because we all respond to what we think needs to be done at the time. I think, what we all have in common is beyond our own communities is the sense of building a better community for everybody. The Orange County Reparations Commission has given me the platform to really speak on behalf of or advocate for the rights of a lot of people. And I will tell you that most of the people in Orange County, the policymakers, they're not bad people. They just don't know. And sometimes we just need to remind ourselves that just because a person's not comfortable doesn't mean they're racist. I learned very early on as the transformation from white to non-white came, that if a woman who lived in a home for 50 years all of a sudden saw different people next door to her and she was uncomfortable, that doesn't mean that she's evil. That's just a reaction people have to change. So you kind of have to, I like to work on the concept that people are basically good. This anti-Asian sentiment was out of fear. Unfortunately, we had a leader at the time that kind of promoted and stirred the pot. In fact, just going back to the internment, there was a congressional study that evaluated why the Japanese were interned. They said it was race prejudice, which of course in the 40s there was a lot of race prejudice. There was war hysteria, of course, right after Pearl Harbor people were afraid. But the most important thing and the reason why I stay involved is the fact that they had failed political leadership. The only person of any elected status in this whole country that stood up for Japanese American was Ralph Carr. He was the governor of Colorado. He stood up. In fact, that's how my family ended up in Colorado. He welcomed the Japanese Americans because he grew up in the Japanese American community in Colorado. But he was the only one. And that was, so that to me, the key to our democracy is making sure you elect people that understand their obligations as an elected official. When you swear to uphold the Constitution and Bill of Rights, you're not saying just the Republicans or the Democrats or the whites or the blacks. It's everybody. And, and I think that's really my litmus test as far as who I'm really comfortable working for, somebody that understands that we're all here as Americans.
You also have an opportunity to be seated at the table by reputation and by your work with the Orange County Human Relations. When you are at the seated table, how do you see shaping public policy?
I think it's a question of being open. And I've told anybody that comes to Orange County, if you come here and try to tell people what to do, you'll get thrown out. People don't not want to be told what to do. They want to know how to solve a problem. And they really want to solve the problem internally by people that are the constituents. So to me, the key to getting things done is having people being educated as far as what's going on. For example, that hate crime thing. We went from absolute denial to what happened recently. Then we have a district attorney, Todd Spitzer. Now, he's a very controversial man. I've known him for 20 years, but he's certainly somebody that stands against hate crimes. In fact, the first hate crime that was adjudicated while he was, that was determined, I guess when he was DEA, he went to the court when the verdict was announced and the sentence was announced. He says, no, that's not enough. I'm not going to accept it because this guy has this whole history of being a hateful person. So we have this more awareness. And the fact that, like I said, the Board of Supervisors, made that resolution, they didn't turn their back. The fact that they allocated $1 million is the fact that you do things by being at the table. And I've never tried to pretend to tell somebody I know more than they do. I may have a different perspective because of who I am, but I think if you're there to try to solve a problem, you'll get a lot more consideration.
But you also have built bridges to other community, Black community, the Latino community here in Santa Ana.
Well, I think that's one of the functions of being on the commission is the fact that we have had the opportunity to work with underserved communities. And I think that it gives the organization, the communities, a place to speak so that their message can be forwarded in conjunction with the community or otherwise. It's a wonderful position to be in. The Commission and Council is just really a great vehicle for that.
What do you feel you personally learned by meeting other leaders in other communities who are struggling with issues and barriers in their own community?
I think we all suffer from the fact that we don't want to be victims. We don't want to be treated differently. And if there's some element in the community that wants to treat us differently, we want to try to minimize the impact of that, or hopefully educate them to that it's not the case. It's a sad state of affairs. I mean, the anti-Asian hate is very recent, but in the 30 years I've been on the Commission and Council, the Jewish community and the Black community have always otherwise been the highest victims of hate crimes. The Black community is amazing. There's only 3% African Americans in Orange County. They're always one of the highest victims of hate crimes. The Jewish community, the anti-Semitism is still prevalent, unfortunately. So we just have to continue to work together, talk to the people that are policymakers, in the hope that they understand. Let me give you an example. When I was the chairman of the Huntington Beach Human Relations Task Force, one of the things we wanted to do was have the city council recognize all the heritage months. And they said, that's cool, but we got this problem with this Gay and Lesbian Pride Month. Let's not include them. He said, well, you got to include all of them. We finally got a mayor that had the courage, and it was really interesting. The mayor was an ex-military guy, who you would not think would be warm and fuzzy towards accepting Gay and Lesbian Pride Month, but he did. So at the meeting, when the city council announced, we're very proud to announce this is Gay and Lesbian Pride Month, by coincidence, the Boy Scouts gave the Pledge of Allegiance. And there's a lot of antagonism between that organization at that time and Gay and Lesbian. I was there, I expected some pushback. But because the city council had the courage to say this is something we're going to acknowledge, we accept, we welcome people in our community, nobody said a thing. So for that moment in time, the Huntington Beach City Council was light years ahead of everybody else here because they were saying we are one. Now city council has changed, and Huntington Beach has gone through certain changes that haven't been consistent with that policy. But that goes back to that thing I said earlier. Elected officials need to understand why they're elected.
Is there anything that you want to say to other educators that will be at this conference in April? If you could leave them with one thing in their mind in terms of social transformation and learning from their experiences.
Well, I don't pretend to be an educator, and I don't know that I can give any wisdom to somebody that spent their whole time in education. I guess the one thing that I realize is that when we work with the youth, we're working with the future. And that the future of this country depends on people having the ability to work through differences. We're always going to have differences, and it's just a question of what we do with those differences as far as that'll affect the impact of where we go as a country. But I do respect the Education Committee because they certainly are the home base for the young people as far as explaining to them the way things are and what their responsibilities are as Americans.
To people who don't understand who Japanese Americans are and their culture, what do you want them to know about the culture so there could be better understanding instead of fear?
Well, okay. That last thing kind of changed my answer. First of all, there shouldn't be any fear because we're just like anybody else. And as far as understanding, we're not special. We're like everybody else. We're trying to become part of the broader social fabric. The outmarriage rate is so high that maybe 5 generations there won't be a Japanese American community. My own family, there's 14 cousins. I'm the only one that married Japanese American, as an example. But I think one of the things that does make us unique is the fact that quite a few of us have the feeling that we want to make sure what happened to us doesn't happen to anybody else. And I think that we carry that because we believe in the country. We saw what the country did for us. We want to make sure that what they did to us, then they apologized to us. We want to make sure that it doesn't happen to anybody else.
There's a Japanese expression, the nail that sticks up gets hammered out, right?
That's exactly right.
So aren't you a contradiction in that?
I think you're right. And that's a lot of the reasons why so many people went to camp passively, so to speak. They weren't happy, but they went. But I think that there's also a feeling of what's right and wrong. And I think that when something's wrong, people need to speak up, and I think our communities learned that. But we're not special. We've just had something happen to us that a lot of us would like to make sure doesn't happen again. Now, I wear this American flag. This is an interesting story. I wear it because of Secretary Norm Mineta. Secretary Norm Mineta was Secretary of
Transportation.
Commerce under Clinton,
Yeah.
and Secretary of Transportation under Bush. And I don't know if you remember, but right after 9/11, when the Twin Towers went down, everybody wanted to take the Arabs and put them in the jail. Mineta said, "That's not going to happen because you did that to my community." And it's interesting. I talked to Secretary Mineta many years later, and I thanked him for that. He said, President Bush was on my side 110%. So even in the worst crisis that we had, there were people at the top, the leadership, that understood the Constitution had to work for everybody. But going back to Mr. Mineta, he's got an airport named after him. And his grandparents say, "Grandpa, why is that named after you?" He says, "I don't know. It just was." But even the man of that status wears an American pin because he knows there's going to be people looking at him and not seeing an American. And I think that's the reality of the world we live in as Asian Americans. And that's not wrong. People have their own, they see things through different lenses. That's why I usually wear an American flag when I'm in public.
Say something in Japanese.
I can't. Konnichiwa. Sayonara.
Thank you.